Let's look at the forms we're going to be using for drawing the human figure. We're going to start off with the form for the head, which is going to consist of a sphere, and we need an orientation for this sphere. We could just put the cross lines on it like we did before, but I think what might be an easier way to do it is to have a sphere, and you can think of this as maybe the brain area of the head, and then we just need a face area of the head. So this might be the face part of the head. So it's a circle and an ellipse. Cross line can be helpful. This gives us an orientation. A sphere by itself, we don't really know where that's pointing. This one feels like it's looking down that way. This one, we really don't have any clue. Maybe it's looking straight at us. Maybe it's looking away from us. Maybe it's looking slightly up. Think about that when you're putting the head down. We need a direction the head is facing. It doesn't have to be anything super complex, just some sense we can get of which direction that face is looking. And that's it for the head. It's just going to be a basic sphere, but I would call it a sphere with a mask. That's going to allow you to orient it, point it different directions. For the chest, we're going to use the box or the cube, but I would think of this as more of a box. Find that close corner. It's going to be taller than it is wide. And maybe for this, we'll be up above. And that's enough. That's plenty. This tells me I'm up above the chest. I can see some of the front of the chest, and I can see the side of the chest. If you want to get fancier than that, you can put an arc here. Show off some of that dimension. It'll feel a little more like a rib cage that way. You can add bend to the chest if you notice that the torso is on a C curve. And again, you don't have to do this, but you can. We're not being sticklers for the rules of perspective here necessarily. We just want to hint at being able to see the bottom, being able to see the side, being able to see some of the front. What are we seeing? Where are we in relation to this chest? Maybe along an S-curve, the chest would have a little bit of shape to it. Again, these are if you want to get fancy. This one will do just fine. And even without the arc, all we need to know is, what am I seeing? Even this will be enough. This tells me I'm below this chest. I see a lot of the side and some of the front. So that's going to be what we use for a chest. It's going to just be the cube or box is what I would call it here. What I want you to think of for the hips is just a half sphere or a hemisphere. There are a couple of ways to make it. So you can make the whole sphere, and then you can draw this ellipse here, and that just cuts the sphere. And then you can say, do I see into the top or do I not? Let's say I do see into the top. Then that's going to be open. So I'll firm those lines up. That'll be my hemisphere. A shortcut to this is to start with your ellipse and then just round out the sphere. And let's say I see this one from above, so my ellipse is open. If I were to do the same one from below, I'll just do a smaller version here. So I'm up above these hips. I can see into the top, like maybe if there was a straight line. But this one, let's say I'm below it. That'd be that same situation. Just close that top ellipse, shows me that I'm down below this. Your job is to decide, is there a tilt to the hemisphere? Is it straight? What's it doing? Practice making these in your sketchbook, either with the ellipse and the half circle, or a sphere that you cut in half. Okay, that does it for the trunk of the body. That does it for the core. So head is going to be that sphere with a mask. Chest is going to be a box. And hips are going to be this half sphere. Our joints are just going to be spheres, and you can just leave them as circles, really. They'll look like spheres in the end because of how much dimension the other forms have. Don't worry about putting a crosshair on every single joint to make it look like a sphere. A circle will do. What I would advise when using circles or spheres for joints in a geometric figure is to prioritize your joints. So if this were a shoulder joint, for instance, shoulders are big. There's a lot of movement that comes from a shoulder, so it's going to be a relatively big sphere. The elbow, by comparison, is just a slightly smaller sphere. There's a smaller range of motion. It's not quite as big of a joint. And then the wrist smaller still. That can help the figure to feel more accurate or feel better in the end result, in the end drawing. And then for limbs, as you might guess, so upper arms and lower arms, upper legs and lower legs are just going to be cylinders. One thing to think about when building cylinders for body parts, again, you can just do a basic cylinder, it's totally fine, but if you want to dress things up a little bit, as you're making the cylinder, you can think, okay, this is a thigh. Let's say that this is the top of a thigh. The width of the top of a thigh is pretty wide, and as we get to the knee, it gets a little bit narrower. How much narrower? Not a ton, but some. The knee is narrower than the hip. And then rather than just doing straight, perfectly straight lines here, which again is fine, if that's easier for you to do, that's totally fine, but I can add a little bit of character to this cylinder. And here's what I might do for a thigh. If this is the top of the thigh, it tends to have this C curve nature, and the bottom of a thigh tends to have an S curve nature. Let's say I can't see into the top of this leg. It's coming slightly towards me. That's going to feel more like a thigh just because we've added some of the nature of the thigh to it. That single C curve across the top, that slight S curve across the bottom. Hopefully you can feel that feeling like a thigh already. Okay, so that does it for the limbs. That's going to be spheres and cylinders to dress out the limbs. Just to show you what the process might look like, let's do a drawing, and I'm going to have you draw along with me on this one. Feel free to stop the video anytime, slow it down if you have to, but walk through this with me, draw it in your sketchbook with me. I'm just going to draw an arm from imagination so we can get the step-by-step process. And I would recommend you practice this a few times in your sketchbook. So I'm going to start with a gesture. I'm going to call that the arm. It's just a flow. It's like zoop, woo, like C curve, S curve, and that's enough. So that's going to be my gesture. On top of my gesture, I would start finding the geometric forms. I'm going to play connect the dots with the joints. I'm drawing very lightly here, by the way. There's my shoulder, there's my elbow, and there's my wrist. And you can see that hierarchy at play here. Shoulder's larger, elbow's slightly less large, wrist is smaller. That's going to give me the axis or the orientation of my cylinders, and I'm just going to put that down in straight lines, just lightly. Those straight lines are going to help me keep my cylinder oriented properly. Now I'm going to put the ends on my cylinder. This is like we constructed the cylinders before. End number 1, I'm overlapping this circle or sphere for the joint, and I'm going to do the same thing down here. So there's a little bit of overlap there. It's going to show me depth. Forearm, overlap that as well. Wrist is also overlapped. For hands and feet, some kind of wedge thing. Don't even worry about trying to make a geometric form out of the hands for now. Mainly what we're worried about now is the core of the body and the limbs, arms and legs. We need to deal with the major parts of the body first. So now I need sides on my cylinder. I'm going to add just a little bit of character to these. Right, that's going to feel a lot more like an upper arm. It's not perfect. It's based a little bit on the anatomy that's there, but even if you just slightly taper them like a bowling pin or something, maybe not with quite so narrow a neck as a bowling pin, then it'll read a little more organic. And again, straight lines is fine. I just can't help myself. Forearm, I'm going to go S curve here and C curve there because that's what forearms tend to be like. I'm going to say I cannot see into the end of this part of the arm, so maybe the wrist I could. Overlap with that joint. So I want this sphere to sit in front of the end of this cylinder so that it shows me some dimension. Let's say I can't see into the bottom either, but I can see into the top. I'm going to firm that up so it overlaps, and then elbow is behind both of those. Okay, so that's the step-by-step. That's what will take me from a gesture up through to this geometric figure. And you saw me approach it very methodically, very step-by-step. You may come up with different answers, and you absolutely will come up with different answers when you're observing the figure. If you're observing the figure, then you just ask yourself, am I below or am I above? That's what this practice is good for, to train you to use that three-dimensional thinking. If you're just making it up out of nowhere, as long as you're consistent, it'll make sense. And that's the step-by-step that we will do this drawing in, working from gesture through to building those geometric forms. And in the end, the final result will be a clean line drawing. So you're going to need to practice drawing lightly so you don't draw so dark that you can't give us a clean line at the end.